a brightly lit stadium where tens of thousands of people roar Adriano's name as if he is the center of the world. But deep down, he has never belonged there, because every step he takes on the European grass always brings back memories of a dark alley in Rio where he grew up amid gunfire, amid poverty, amid days when simply surviving was already a victory, and that very contrast created a nameless pain when he was forced to become a cold symbol in the eyes of the world, while inside he remained a child of the favela who could not leave his family, could not forget the father who taught him to play soccer and taught him how to stand firm amid chaos. And when that father passed away, he did not just lose a loved one, but also lost the only anchor that allowed the two lives inside him to coexist. And from that moment, everything began to crack. He still scored goals, still ran, still won. But every time the lights went out, he returned to an emptiness that could not be filled. An emptiness that forced him to fight every day, to pull himself up, even when there was no clear reason to continue. And it was precisely in that inner struggle that he did not collapse immediately, but existed through sheer will, through habit, through memories of who he once was, trying to hold on to the fragments of two lives that were slipping from his hands. But the man carrying that very struggle once stood at a height very few players could reach when he became one of the most fearsome strikers in the world. In the colors of Inter Milan, winning 4 Serie A titles, 2 Coppa Italia, and 2 Italian Super Cups, scoring more than 70 goals for the club during his peak years, once honored as one of the best players in Europe, making the Team of the Year and competing for major individual awards, and in the Brazil shirt he scored 27 goals in 48 matches, won the Copa America 2004 as top scorer, went on to win the Confederations Cup 2005 and was the focal point of the national team attack, seen as the worthy successor to Ronaldo Nazario, a goal-scoring machine with power, speed, and shots that left the whole world in awe. A symbol that once made every defense tremble. And although his story did not last as long as other legends, what he achieved in that short time was still enough to etch his name into the memory of world soccer. Before we continue with Adriano's story, please hit like and leave a heart as a quiet way to send respect to the man who had to carry the weight of living between two lives that no one truly understood. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel so we can follow together the journey behind that spotlight where a man who once had everything gradually lost himself. The life that Adriano tried to hold on to under the stadium lights actually began in a completely different place, without light, without protection, without any notion of a peaceful childhood, the Vila Cruzeiro slum in Rio de Janeiro, where the sound of gunfire was not something that startled people, but part of the rhythm of life, where children grew up, not by choice but by the instinct to survive, and Adriano was no exception. He did not have carefree days running and jumping on lush green fields, did not have peaceful afternoons after school. Instead, there were narrow alleys, stained walls, nights when every strange noise made people hold their breath because no one knew what would happen next. And in that world, safety did not exist as a right, but as a luxury very few could reach. So from a very young age, Adriano learned to stay silent, learned to observe, learned not to ask too many questions because sometimes the answers could make everything worse. And very early on, he understood that he did not have many choices, that life would not wait for him to grow up before it started testing him, that it had already begun before he even realized he was in it. And amid all the fragile things existing in that chaos, family became the only thing keeping him from sliding completely into darkness. A small house, simple meals, ordinary conversations that carried more meaning than anything else, because that was the only place he felt he belonged, the only place he did not need to defend himself, did not need to pretend to be strong. And especially that was where his father was, the man he would later realize was the center of his entire life. But in those years when everything had not yet been lost, Adriano simply knew that when his father was there, everything seemed easier to breathe, that in an unstable world, there was a small anchor enough to keep him standing firm. And then, amid all that deprivation, soccer appeared not as a grand dream, but as a way to survive. An old ball, a small clearing on the street, a few kids gathering, and the match began, without rules, without a referee, without spectators, only focus, survival, and a rare joy that slipped through every touch of the ball. Adriano played soccer not to become a professional player, but because when he played he forgot the gunfire, forgot the fear, forgot the feeling of being trapped in a place with no way out. Every shot was not just an action, but a release. A way to prove that no matter where or in what circumstances, he could still control a small part of his life. But even in those moments, the fear never completely disappeared. It only retreated into the background, waiting, present in watchful eyes, in the long silences when night fell, in the way everyone learned not to say too much, not to reveal too much, because their emotions were sometimes a luxury, and silence was the only way to protect oneself. And Adriano grew up with that silence, carrying it into every step, every decision, every moment of his life until he left that place. But even after he left, that slum never left him. It existed in his memories, in the way he saw the world, in the way he reacted to pain. And perhaps that is exactly why, when everything later began to collapse, Adriano did not react like a star, but like a boy who had learned how to endure, who had learned how to stay silent, who had learned that sometimes the only way to survive was to keep everything inside even if it was slowly breaking him apart. And in a world where fear became so familiar it was no longer named, where everything could disappear after just one night, Adriano still had one thing that never changed: his father. An imperfect man, not rich, unable to protect his son from all the dangers outside, but the only place that made the boy feel safe, not because he could control the world, but because when he was there, the world seemed less terrifying. The days passed not marked by grand milestones, but by small moments. The evenings when father and son sat together after a long day, simple stories, unadorned advice enough for a child to understand he was not completely alone. And in those moments, Adriano was not a boy from the slum, but simply a son listening to his father, feeling a rare peace that the outside world could not bring. It was his father who first saw in him something the boy himself had not fully understood, not just the ability to play soccer, but the way he touched the ball as if it were the only language he could use to express everything he could not say in words. And it was also his father who turned those street games into something bigger, not just play, but a path, an opportunity, an escape, even though at that time neither could clearly imagine where it would lead. But faith had begun to form. A simple faith, almost naive, that if he continued, if he tried, if he did not give up, then perhaps one day life would be different. And in every step Adriano took, the image of his father was always there, in the way he ran, in the way he shot, in the way he stood up after every fall, because soccer had never been just his own. It was always tied to the one who had brought him to it, the one who stood beside him, watched, encouraged, and sometimes simply stayed silent but still present. And that very presence created a sense of solidity nothing could replace, a feeling that no matter how chaotic the outside world was, there was still a place to return to, still someone who understood him without needing explanation. And for a child who grew up in such an environment, that was not only love, but the foundation of existence, the thing that kept everything from collapsing completely. But as he grew older and began to realize the world was not as simple as those peaceful evenings, Adriano started carrying a quiet fear inside, not fear of violence or poverty, things he was already used to, but fear of losing the only person who made all of that bearable, a fear never spoken, never acknowledged, but always there, slipping into the quietest moments, into times when he saw his father tired after a day of work, into moments when he realized even the strongest could not fight time. And although no one said it, Adriano understood that one day that father would no longer be there. And when that day came, everything would change in a way he could not control. But when young people often choose not to think about it, choose to believe that the most important things will always exist, that family will always be there, that love will not disappear, and Adriano was no different. He continued to play soccer, continued to grow up, continued to carry the belief that as long as he had his father, everything would be okay, that no matter where life took him, no matter how far it brought him, there would still be an invisible thread holding him, keeping him from getting lost, from losing himself. But that very belief, that seemingly simple trust, later became the thing that made everything harder to accept, because when it was taken away, nothing was strong enough to replace it, and all that remained was an emptiness that no title, no goal, no praise could ever fill. And then came a time when everything was no longer limited to narrow alleys or street soccer games, when Adriano's talent began to be noticed, when people around him no longer just called him a kid who played soccer well, but started seeing him as an opportunity, a rare escape from the life that had been mapped out since birth. And it was from there that the path leading him away from Brazil began to form, not through completely voluntary choice, but through the push of circumstances, of hope, of the belief that if he did not go, everything would stay the same forever. And when he stepped onto the flight leaving Rio, Adriano did not bring much except a dream without clear shape, a heart still tightly attached to the place he grew up, and the image of his father always left behind as an inseparable part. But right from the first days setting foot in Europe, he felt a distance no one could clearly explain, not just language, not just culture, but the feeling that he did not belong here. The clean streets, the perfect training fields, the quiet rooms, so quiet they made one feel empty, all too different from where he once lived. And that very difference did not bring a sense of safety, but on the contrary made him feel more lost than ever, as if he were existing in a world not meant for him, where everything had order but lacked the warmth he once had. And the long nights began to appear, nights when Adriano lay alone in a strange room, no conversations, no familiar sounds, only a silence so long it made thoughts clearer than ever, memories of family, of the small alley, of simple evenings with his father, all appearing not as beautiful memories, but as reminders that he was very far from where he belonged. And in those moments the phone became the only thread connecting him to the old world. Calls home were no longer ordinary habits, but became indispensable, a way to keep himself from being completely swept into loneliness. Every time he heard the familiar voice, every time he knew someone somewhere was waiting, Adriano could continue one more day, one more training session, one more match. But even when he began to adapt, when his talent was gradually recognized, when doors to big clubs began to open, the inner conflict never disappeared, because every step forward in his career also meant moving even further away from everything familiar. Every success pulled him further from family, from his father, from the life that, though difficult, was the only place he felt like himself. And that very contradiction began to grow quietly, not loudly, not clearly, but enough to make every moment of success no longer complete, enough to make Adriano realize that the dream he was chasing did not only bring opportunities, but also carried a price he was not truly ready to pay, because while the outside world saw a young player moving closer to the peak, inside he was still just a son trying to hold on to everything he had, trying not to let the distance become loss, trying to believe he could move forward while keeping everything behind. But the farther he went, the more he realized it was not as easy as he once thought, that there were things he could not bring with him, and there were things that no matter how hard he tried would gradually slip from his grasp. And then, as the distance between the two worlds stretched further, Adriano began to enter the phase where everything he had endured seemed to transform into an explosive power on the soccer field. When he put on the colors of Inter Milan and for the first time felt what the world called the peak, where every run of his was no longer just an effort to survive, but became an obsession for any defense that dared stand in front, where his left foot shots were not simply finishes, but explosions from everything that had been suppressed over the years before. Powerful, fierce, and unrelenting, making all of Europe turn to look, to admit that something very different was appearing. A striker who not only possessed physique, speed, and technique, but also carried a primal feeling, an almost uncontrollable instinct. And in those moments, Adriano no longer felt lost, no longer felt like an outsider, because on the field, he could control everything. He could decide the outcome. He could make tens of thousands of people stand up with just one touch of the ball, and that very feeling, that rare feeling of power, began to become what he clung to as a way to forget everything outside the field. Fame came so fast that even he could not fully understand it. From a boy who left Rio with doubts, he became a name appearing on every newspaper, mentioned in every soccer conversation, hailed as a new symbol of power and instinct, and comparisons began to appear, not with just anyone, but with Ronaldo Nazario, a name big enough to put pressure on any player. But for Adriano, that was not only honor, but also another burden placed on his shoulders, because when people began to see him as the successor, they no longer saw his true self. They only saw expectations, saw the image they wanted him to become. And while the outside world celebrated every goal, every title, Adriano gradually realized that success did not bring the peace he once thought. It only made everything bigger, clearer, and harder to escape. But he still continued, not because he had found happiness, but because he no longer had any other choice. Because every time he scored, every time he heard the crowd roar, every time he saw his name on the scoreboard, he could temporarily forget the emptiness inside, could temporarily believe everything was going in the right direction, that the sacrifices, the separations, the long, lonely nights, all had meaning. And that is why success was no longer the goal, but became a means, a way to keep himself from facing the questions he had never been ready to answer. And in those years when everything seemed to be on his side, when the world called him the Emperor, when stadiums shook every time he touched the ball, Adriano still continued to run, continued to shoot, continued to win, as if only by not stopping, only by continuing forward. The things behind him could not catch up with him. But there are things that do not need to chase because they have always been there, quietly, patiently, waiting for a moment when he no longer had the strength to keep running, and when everything seemed to have reached its peak, when the name Adriano became a symbol of power and destruction on the field, life outside the pitch began to flow in a different direction, a direction he had never truly chosen, where luxurious apartments, lavish parties, first-class flights, and non-stop flashing lights became part of daily life. But the more he was present in that world, the more he realized all those things did not feel real, did not bring the warmth he once knew. Everything was perfect in a cold way. Every smile came at the right time. Every compliment rang out when needed. But something was missing that he could not name. And while those around him looked in and saw life worth dreaming of, Adriano felt as if he were standing outside his own life, as if he were only playing a role that everyone believed was real. But he did not, because deep inside there was still a feeling of not belonging that never disappeared, and the pressure began to grow with each day. No longer just the pressure to score or to win, but the pressure to maintain the image of an emperor, a person not allowed to be weak, not allowed to slow down, not allowed to show any sign of fatigue, because in the eyes of the world he was no longer an ordinary person, but a symbol, a standard, something everyone wanted to believe existed in a state of perfection. And the media kept pushing that image further. Every match, every goal, every moment on the field was analyzed, evaluated, exaggerated. And when he played well, it was taken for granted. But the moment there was a small mistake, a match not up to expectations, everything immediately became a problem, became a topic for discussion, for criticism, for questions. And in that vortex, Adriano had no space to breathe, no place left to be himself, because even when he left the field, he was still being watched, judged, evaluated. And the empty moments began to appear more often, moments when he sat alone in a large but cold room, no noise, no crowd, no teammates, only silence and thoughts he could not avoid, questions about where he was, what he was doing, and whether all of this truly belonged to him or not. And it was in those moments that the truth became clearer than ever, that although he was living in a world millions craved, he did not feel he belonged to it, that everything he had achieved was not enough to fill the gap between the person he once was and the person the world wanted him to become. And the fatigue did not come from the physical, did not come from back-to-back matches, but from having to maintain an image that was never allowed to crack, having to continue smiling when he did not want to, having to continue being strong when inside he had begun to weaken, having to continue moving forward when he was no longer sure he was going in the right direction. And the more he tried to hold everything together, the more he felt he was losing the most important thing. Not fame, not money, but himself, a person who was once simple, once clear, once knew where he belonged, now trapped between two worlds that could not reconcile. One world that had lifted him to the peak, and one world he had never left in his mind. And that very struggle, quiet but relentless, began to wear him down from the inside, little by little, until nothing could keep everything intact as before. And then one day, in the non-stop cycle of fame and pressure, when everything outside still seemed unchanged, Adriano received a call from Brazil, a call that at the moment it began he could not know would divide his life into two completely different halves. One side the person before, who still had an anchor to return to, and one side the person after, who had to learn how to exist without anywhere left to hold on to. The voice on the other end did not need to be long, did not need much explanation, because just a few words everything became clear. His father had passed away, the man who had once been the center of the small world he carried throughout his life, the only one who made every fear bearable, the one he always believed would always be there, no matter how great the geographic distance. And in that moment, all sound seemed to disappear. No more noise, no clear thoughts, only a sudden emptiness opening up as if a part of him had been pulled away with no way to keep it. He did not react like a star, did not keep up the image, did not control his emotions, because nothing mattered anymore. Everything he had tried to maintain, all the pressure he had endured, all the success he had achieved became meaningless before a simple but cruel truth, that the only person who understood him was no longer there. And when Adriano collapsed, it was not a fleeting moment of weakness, but a total breakdown, something that could not be repaired by time, could not be hidden by fame, could not be soothed by comforting words, because what he lost was not only a father, but the foundation that kept his life from falling into chaos, the thread connecting him to his true self. And when that thread was cut, he no longer knew where he was standing, no longer knew what he was heading toward, and no longer sure he could continue as before. The days after that were unclear, without structure, just a series of moments passing in a heavy state, where everything around continued. There were still matches, still training sessions, still demands he had to meet. But inside, Adriano was no longer the person who had stepped onto the field with determination. Before, every run became heavier. Every shot no longer carried the same meaning, because soccer, which had once been the thread connecting him to his father, now became a painful reminder of what he had lost. And in that silence, no one truly understood what was happening, because the outside world only saw the results, saw the form, saw the numbers, but no one saw the emptiness expanding inside him. No one saw the way a part of him had disappeared right from that moment. And the scariest thing was not the immediate collapse, but the fact that he still continued to stand there, still continued to play, still continued to exist as if everything was still normal, while in reality, nothing was normal anymore. Because from that second, Adriano not only lost his father, he lost the feeling of safety, lost the simple belief that everything would be okay, lost the ability to return to a place where he could be himself without having to try. And when a person loses all of that, they are not just sad, they are not just in pain. They become empty in a way that no title, no victory, no praise can ever reach. And it was precisely from that moment that Adriano's life was no longer a journey upward, but became a prolonged effort not to collapse completely. And from after that moment, when everything seemed to continue moving along the old orbit, when the match schedule was still packed, the training field was still crowded, and the lights were still waiting for him every weekend, the pain inside Adriano did not ease with time. As many people still think, it did not disappear, did not fade gradually, but stayed there, quietly but persistently, like a crack running through every thought, every action, every moment, making everything look intact on the outside but in reality no longer the same as before. The days passed no longer measured by achievements or the number of goals, but by the way he tried to get through each hour, each training session, each match without revealing that inside he had changed. A change that even he did not know how to name, only knowing that he no longer felt like before, no longer felt the excitement when stepping onto the field, no longer felt the connection with what used to be his drive. Everything became unfamiliar, as if he was watching his own life from a distance that could not be shortened. And in that distance, habits began to change, not suddenly, but little by little, from training sessions where he no longer arrived on time, from moments of prolonged silence when teammates were talking, from the way he avoided other people's eyes as if he did not want to be seen too clearly, because if someone looked long enough, they might realize that he was no longer the person they once knew. And it was precisely in those empty spaces that alcohol began to appear not as a choice, but as something that came very naturally, a way to soothe thoughts that could not stop, a way to make the night shorter, to make memories less clear, to make the pain fade even if only for a moment. And at first it was only a temporary solution, a small thing he believed he could control. But as time went on, the line between controlling and being swept away began to grow thin, because every time he returned to reality, everything was still there, unchanged, not reduced, and alcohol gradually became the only way not to face directly the emptiness growing inside him. At the same time, the distance between him and those around him also became clearer, not because they changed, but because he no longer had the ability to connect as before. Conversations became awkward. Training sessions no longer brought the feeling of belonging. The locker room, which used to be a space of connection, now became the place where he felt most lost. Because while everyone was still laughing and sharing, he did not know what to say, did not know where to begin, and gradually, silence became the only choice, not because he did not want to speak, but because he no longer knew how to express what he was feeling. And that very silence created a distance that no one actively broke, making him increasingly separated from the team, from the environment he once belonged to, and in that process, the motivation that once pushed him through every difficulty, once made him keep moving forward, also began to fade, not disappearing immediately, but dissolving slowly like a fire no longer fed. Because when the deepest reason to continue was no longer there, everything left was not strong enough to keep him on the old path. Matches no longer carried meaning, victories no longer brought joy, and every time he stepped onto the field, Adriano no longer felt he was getting closer to something, but only completing something others expected, and that very feeling, the feeling of living without a clear goal, without solid belief, made everything heavier with each day, each week, each month, until the change was no longer something that could be hidden, no longer something that existed only inside but began to show on the outside in his form, in his attitude, in the way he was present. And although the world continued to see him as a star, a talented player, a symbol not yet completely gone, Adriano knew that the person who had once been the foundation of all that was no longer there, and what remained was not weakness, not giving up, but a prolonged state of existence where he continued to move forward not because he wanted to, but because he had not yet found any other way. And then there were days when everything seemed to have reached the limit. But Adriano still stepped onto the field as if nothing had happened, still ran, still collided, still unleashed shots that made tens of thousands of people jump up, still scored amid the roar of the stands. And in the moment the ball nestled in the net, every eye turned to him as if there was no sign of any crack, as if he was still the emperor they had trusted. A man who knew no limits, knew no weakness, and those very moments created a painful paradox, because the more successful he was on the field, the more he had to hide what was happening outside it. His private life no longer had order, no longer had control. The long nights stretched longer. The mornings came later. The periods when he could not clearly remember what he had done, where, or with whom, and the line between rest and escape became blurred. Alcohol was no longer just a way to soothe the pain, but became part of the rhythm of life, something present in the moments when he did not know what to do with himself. And while the world continued to praise, continued to call his name, continued to believe he was living the life they dreamed of, Adriano felt he was gradually moving away from the person they saw, as if there were two versions existing in parallel but never meeting. One standing under the lights, strong, decisive, full of energy, and the other hidden behind closed doors, silent, tired, no longer in control of his own thoughts. And those two people could not reconcile, could not understand each other, could not exist in the same state, making every transition from the field back to private life a free-fall with no stopping point, no preparation, only a prolonged feeling of emptiness. And the signs began to become clearer, no longer just inner feelings but showing on the outside in the way he moved, in his unfocused eyes, in training sessions where he was no longer the leader, in matches where, although he could still make a difference, he could no longer maintain stability. And those around him began to realize that something was changing, but no one truly understood what was happening. Because what they saw was only the results, the form, the numbers, while what was happening inside him remained out of sight, and that very difference between the two worlds made Adriano increasingly isolated, because he could not share with teammates, could not explain to the coach, could not talk to the media, not because he did not want to, but because he did not know where to begin, did not know how to express a pain without a clear shape, an emptiness that even he did not fully understand. And so he chose silence, chose to continue playing the role everyone expected, chose to step onto the field with a fleeting smile and the familiar determination. But the more he did so, the greater the distance between the two people inside him grew, until there was no way to keep them close anymore. And in all of that, the scariest thing was not that he was gradually losing form, not the criticisms that began to appear, but the feeling that even while standing among millions of people, being seen, being listened to, being mentioned every day, he had never felt so alone, a loneliness that did not come from lacking people around, but from no one truly understanding, no one seeing the real person behind the spotlight. And in that loneliness, Adriano was no longer fighting to win, but only trying to keep himself from completely collapsing, match after match, day after day, moment after moment. And when the cracks inside could no longer be completely hidden, when the small changes began to accumulate into clear signs, the outside world also began to react in ways Adriano could not control. The media no longer saw him as an untouchable symbol, but began to scrutinize every detail of his life, from his performance on the field to what happened off it, and the stories that appeared no longer revolved around his goals or his power, but around missed training sessions, late arrivals, rumors about alcohol, and undisciplined lifestyle. Articles with heavy headlines, unforgiving comments, all gradually creating a different image in the eyes of the public, an image no longer of the emperor but of a player losing himself. And the pain did not lie in the criticisms, but in the fact that no one truly understood what had led him there. No one saw the long, quiet process before everything became clear. No one asked questions about what he had lost, what he was enduring. They only looked at the results and passed judgment. And in the world of soccer, where everything is measured by form and achievements, the lack of understanding became normal. But for Adriano, it was not only professional pressure, but the feeling of being completely isolated, as if he was being pushed out of the very place where he had once been honored. And his relationship with the coach and the club also began to change. No longer absolute trust as before, but gradually doubts appeared. Stricter demands, conversations that no longer encouraged but became reminders and warnings. And in training sessions in the locker room, Adriano no longer felt the connection as before, but instead distance, scrutinizing eyes, uncomfortable silence, and that made him withdraw even more, made it harder for him to open up. Because when people start to see you as a problem, it is very hard to feel you are still part of them. And while everything outside gradually became tense inside him, nothing was changing for the better. The pain was still there. The emptiness was still there. The only difference was that now he not only had to face it alone, but also had to face a world that was gradually turning its back on him, and that created a deep feeling of abandonment, not in the physical sense because he was still there, still playing soccer, still present, but mentally he felt he was standing alone in the crowd that no longer stood by his side. And in all of that, no one stopped to ask him a simple question, whether he was okay. No one truly cared about what was happening inside him, because in their eyes, he was still a professional player, a person responsible for his own form, a person who had to overcome difficulties like anyone else. And the very absence of that simple question, the absence of basic understanding, made everything many times heavier. Because when a person is in that state, what they need is not more pressure, not judgments, but an acknowledgement that they are struggling, that what they are going through is real. And when that does not exist, they are forced to carry everything themselves, to fight alone, to find a way to stand firm on their own. And Adriano in those years was not only fighting his form, the media, expectations, but also fighting himself, fighting what no one saw, fighting a pain no one asked about. And it was in that battle that he gradually lost more than what the world could measure. Not only his place in the lineup, not only his fame, but the feeling of belonging, the feeling of being understood, the feeling that he was not completely alone. And then what had previously been only signs, only small cracks, began to spread into a clear collapse when Adriano's form could no longer be maintained as before, not because he no longer had the ability, but because he was no longer the person who had created those moments. Every touch of the ball lost its certainty. Every finish no longer carried the same confidence, and matches that before he could decide in just a few seconds now became heavy and slow, as if every run carried an invisible weight. And when the numbers began to change, when goals no longer came regularly, when his influence on the field diminished, the team's trust also gradually shook. No longer certain looks, no longer absolute expectation, but instead difficult decisions, times when he was substituted early, matches when he did not start, and for a player who had once been the center of every tactic, once the anchor of the whole team, that change was not only a professional issue, but a direct blow to himself. Because when you are no longer trusted, you begin to question yourself, begin to doubt what you once achieved, begin to look in the mirror and to no longer recognize the person who once stood there. And Adriano, in his effort to hold on to everything, did not stand still. He tried to come back, tried to train more, tried to find the lost feeling again. But those efforts did not bring the results he wanted because what he was facing was not only in physical condition or technique, but deeper, in a place training sessions could not reach, in a place where sheer willpower was not enough to change, and every time he failed to return, every time he could not meet expectations, it made the distance between the current person and the previous person even greater, making the disorientation increasingly clear, because he no longer knew which direction to go, no longer knew what was right, what was enough. And in that state, everything around also no longer kept a clear shape. Advice from the coach became hard to accept. Encouragement from teammates became distant, because when a person no longer believes in himself, it is very hard for him to believe in anyone else. And it was precisely in this period that Adriano not only lost his form, but also lost his direction, something he had never had to think about before. Because the path had always been clear, always had goals, always had reasons to move forward. But now everything became blurred, with no specific destination, no feeling of progress, only a series of days passing without bringing anything certain. And what made everything harder to accept was that no one could pull him back anymore, not because no one wanted to, but because no one really knew how, because what he was going through was not a simple problem that could be solved by discipline or tactics, but an inner breakdown that only he himself could face. But when even he did not know where to begin, did not know what to do to change, then any outside help became insufficient. And Adriano, the man who had once been lifted up by the whole world, now fell into a state where no hand held him back. No anchor was solid enough for him to cling to, only a person standing in an ever-widening emptiness, looking back at what he once had and realizing that no matter how hard he tried, there were things that once lost would never return in the old way again. And then when all the roads ahead gradually became blurred, when staying no longer brought clear meaning as before, Adriano made a decision that for many was a step backward, but for him felt like a natural reflex returning to Brazil, returning to where it all began, as if only by going back to the starting point could he find something left of himself. And when he set foot back in his homeland after the years in Europe, everything was both familiar and strange. The old streets, the old neighborhoods, the familiar sounds of the life he once knew in every detail, all still there, not changed as much as he once thought, but the feeling inside him was different. No longer the boy who left with hope and faith, but a man returning carrying emptiness that could not be filled. And in the first days back in the favela, Adriano was surrounded by familiar faces, family, friends, people who had watched him grow up, people who did not care about fame or failure, but only about his true self. And that very acceptance brought a feeling of relief he had not felt in a long time. Simple meals, conversations without needing to maintain an image, moments when he could laugh without reason, all created a warmth that the glamorous world before could not bring. But even in those moments, the pain did not disappear. It was not erased by the return, because what he lost was not in the location, not in the geographic distance, but deep inside, and no matter how familiar the place he returned to, he could not go back to the person he once was, could not return to the time when everything was still intact, when his father was still there, when faith had not yet been tested, when soccer was still pure joy rather than a burden. And that very thing made the return more complicated, because it both brought comfort and reminded him of what had been lost. Every street corner, every alley, every sound evoked memories not as gentle recollections, but as pieces of a life he could no longer touch in the old way. And when meeting friends again, people still living in the familiar rhythm of the favela, Adriano realized that although he had gone very far, had experienced things they had never seen, there was still a part of him that belonged here, that still understood how they lived, how they thought, and that created a connection he could not find anywhere else. But at the same time it also highlighted the difference, because he was no longer completely like them, no longer a full part of that world, just as he was no longer a full part of the world he had left, and that very standing between two worlds made him feel even more disoriented, because there was no place where he could say he completely belonged. And while on the outside life seemed simpler, with no media pressure, no blinding lights, no enormous expectations, inside the battle continued. The pain still present, not loud but persistent, not destroying immediately, but wearing away over time. And Adriano gradually understood that returning was not a way to heal, but only a way to breathe easier, to exist in an environment where he felt close, but not a place that could bring him back to the person he once was. Because that person had changed, had been reshaped by what he had been through, and no matter how hard he tried, he could not return to the starting point with the same heart, the same faith, the same view of life. And in that acceptance there was no complete relief, only a slow understanding that there are journeys that do not lead to return, but only to a different version of oneself. A version carrying everything that had happened, both the good and the irreplaceable losses. And when Adriano's life gradually stabilized in a very different way, no longer in the orbit the soccer world was once familiar with, his image in the eyes of international media also began to change in a direction increasingly far from reality. Articles no longer talked about a striker who once made Europe tremble, but revolved around stories of a lost career, of a talent that did not fully utilize its potential, of a person who was said to have chosen wrong, and in the way they told that story, everything was simplified to the point of almost becoming distorted, as if his life was only a series of undisciplined decisions leading to an incomplete ending. While no one really stopped to look deeper into what had happened behind, no one mentioned the personal losses, the immeasurable wounds, the periods when he had to face himself without any support, and the very absence of those details created a large gap between the real person and the image the public saw. A gap that over time became increasingly hard to narrow, because when a story has been told and retold in a certain direction, it gradually becomes truth in the eyes of many, even though reality is much more complex. And facing that, Adriano did not choose to refute, did not appear to explain, did not try to repair his image. Not because he did not know, but because he no longer felt it necessary. Because there are things that cannot be expressed in a few sentences, there are pains that cannot be explained in an interview, and there are experiences that only those who live them can fully understand. And when facing a world ready to draw conclusions, trying to change the way they see things, sometimes becomes meaningless. So he chose silence, not as avoidance, but as a way to protect himself, a way to keep what was left of him from being distorted any further. And in that silence he gradually lived in the way he believed was right, no longer controlled by the standards he once had to follow, no longer trying to become the model society expected, but returning to simpler values: family, friends, genuine relationships, moments that did not need to prove anything to anyone. And that very choice created a clear difference between him and the way the world measured success. Because while society often measures a person's value by titles, by a long career, by staying at the peak as long as possible, Adriano went in a different direction. A direction where keeping himself, keeping what was most important to him, became more meaningful than continuing to chase expectations that no longer fit. And that was not easy to accept, not easy to understand, especially in an environment where everything is compared, ranked, evaluated by clear criteria. But he still continued to live his way, even knowing it meant he would continue to be misunderstood, continue to be judged, continue to be placed in stories he did not control. And in all of that there was a quiet steadfastness, not rebellion, not defiance, but a conscious choice, a choice not to lose himself again, no matter the cost of not being recognized by the world in the way they usually do with others. And in that difference, Adriano no longer sought approval, no longer tried to explain, but accepted that his life would never be fully understood from the outside, and perhaps that no longer mattered either. because the only thing he needed now was not recognition, but the peace he had spent too long trying to find again. And in the silence that Adriano had chosen, his life gradually slowed down in a way he had never had the chance to experience before. No more rushed flights, no more packed match schedules, no more stadium lights forcing him to appear as a perfect version of himself. Everything became simpler, with less pressure, but also emptier in a different way. Because when the rhythm of life was no longer swept along, what had been hidden before began to appear more clearly. Memories did not disappear with time, but only changed the way they appeared, sometimes in quiet afternoons, sometimes in sudden moments when a familiar sound rang out, when a street evoked an old image, when a casual sentence made him remember the person who was no longer there. And in those moments, Adriano no longer tried to avoid as before, no longer tried to fill the emptiness with temporary things, but gradually learned to face it. Learn to let the pain exist without letting it completely destroy him, because he began to understand that there are losses that cannot be repaired, cannot be reversed, cannot be replaced, and continuing to live does not mean forgetting, but accepting that they will always be a part of him, whether he wants it or not. And in that process, the simple things he once took for granted became more important than ever. Meals with family, unhurried conversations, moments sitting together without needing to say much, all created a feeling he had lost in the years chasing a life that did not truly belong to him. And it was in that simplicity that Adriano found a different kind of peace. Not excitement, not explosive joy, but a state of stability, a feeling that even though life had changed, even though many things were no longer there were still things left enough for him to continue, enough for him not to be completely empty, and gradually he learned to live with what he had lost, not trying to replace, not trying to replace, not trying to forget, but leaving them there as part of the story, a part that had shaped the person he is now. And in that process he no longer sought recognition from the outside, no longer placed his value in things others judged, but returned to his own standards. The things he believed were right, were enough, even if they did not match the way the world defined success. And perhaps that very change, the shift from trying to become a model to accepting his true self, brought Adriano a peace he could not find anywhere else, not because everything had become better, but because he had stopped trying to make them into what they could not become. And in that acceptance there was a quiet relief, a feeling of no longer having to run, no longer having to prove, no longer having to hold on to things that were leaving, but simply existing with everything he had lost, and everything that still remained. And when looking back at Adriano's entire journey, from a boy who grew up in the narrow alleys of Rio where every day passing was a challenge, where family was everything, and soccer was simply a way to survive, to becoming one of the most fearsome strikers in the world, standing in brightly lit stadiums, hailed as a symbol of power and talent, then falling into another journey where the lights gradually dimmed, where the cheers no longer rang out as before, where everything slowed down and became quieter. His story cannot be summed up in simple concepts like success or failure, because it contains too many layers of meaning, too many twists, too many things that numbers and titles cannot fully reflect. His career, if viewed from the outside, could be seen as brilliant, but incomplete. A short time at the peak, with titles, goals, moments that made the whole world remember, but also a journey interrupted by things he could not control. Unavoidable losses, and those very losses shaped the path he took afterward, because there are things that once they happen will change everything in a way that cannot be reversed. His father's death was not just an event but a boundary, a dividing point between the person he once was and the person he became, and from that moment every choice, every decision carried the influence of that pain. And when he gradually moved away from the peak, when he no longer tried to hold the position the world expected, many people looked in and saw a loss, a waste, something regrettable. But for Adriano, that was not a simple giving up, but a choice, a difficult but necessary choice. The choice to leave a life he could no longer continue living as before, in order to keep the part of himself he did not want to lose anymore. And in that choice there was no perfection, no complete ending the way people usually expect. But there was a different kind of meaning, a different kind of existence, where he was no longer defined by what he achieved on the field, but by the way he continued to live after everything that had happened, and the life he had now, though no longer glamorous, though no longer noticed as before, still carried its own value. A value not in being recognized, but in the fact that he was still there, still continued, still kept what was most important to him. And perhaps if looked at that way, Adriano's story is not a tragedy in the usual sense, but a different kind of survival. A journey where victory does not lie in reaching the peak and staying there forever, but in not completely losing himself when everything around began to collapse. And in a world where success is often measured by what lasts, what is stable, what does not change, his story reminds us that there are other paths, other ways of existing, not perfect, not easy to understand, but still meaningful in its own way. And when all the lights have gone out, when the cheers are only memories, what remains is not what he achieved, but the person he managed to keep after everything. A person no longer intact as before, but still enough to continue living, to continue remembering, and to continue existing in his own way. Adriano's story leaves a very special feeling of sadness, not because he failed in the way people usually think, but because he had to live in an inner struggle that very few people truly understand. From the early parts, when the image of the brightly lit stadium contrasted with the dark alley in Rio, we clearly saw two lives that could not merge into one, and that very division was the root of the tragedy. When he left Brazil carrying memories of family and his father, he was not only pursuing a career, but also trying to keep a part of himself. But the price paid for success was prolonged loneliness and nights with no one by his side. The peak was the call informing him of his father's death, the moment that broke his entire being. And from then on, everything was no longer soccer, but a journey of existence. Details like him still scoring in front of millions of people, but collapsing in silence, or the media criticizing without anyone asking if he was okay, reflect a reality very close to American society, where success often hides mental health issues. The biggest lesson does not lie in regretting talent, but in understanding that a person cannot be defined only by achievements. Adriano chose to leave the peak to keep himself, and that, in a culture that always values success like in the United States, is a strong reminder that mental health, family, and the feeling of belonging are the things that determine whether a life is meaningful. If Adriano's story makes you think about the price of success and the things that are truly important in life, please hit subscribe and leave a heart to spread that understanding. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we continue to explore the stories behind the spotlight that not everyone sees.